The stars had always been watching Earth. Most of them were not impressed. In the year 2387, the planet was still breathing. Busy, loud, messy, and alive. Humans had spread beyond their homeworld by then. There were colonies on Mars, tunnels dug deep inside the asteroid belt, and floating stations orbiting the moons of Jupiter. Earth itself had grown older but no quieter. Cities hummed and buzzed. Ships moved in and out of orbit like insects around a light. The people of Earth had fought each other for centuries, over land, over water, over ideas. And somehow, through all of it, they had not stopped. They had not given up. They had simply kept going. Out among the stars, none of that was considered impressive. The Galactic Conclave was a union of over 400 spacefaring civilizations. Some of its oldest members had been flying between stars before humans had discovered fire. They had their own laws, their own rankings, their own way of looking at the universe. And in their system, Earth was nothing. Officially, the planet was logged as a Tier 0 primitive world, a small, warm rock carrying a young species that had barely left its own solar system. In the Conclave's endless files, Earth was one footnote among millions, a species to be noted, cataloged, and eventually managed when the time came. The time, as far as the Conclave was concerned, had come. A small fleet of 12 Conclave ships entered the Sol system on a quiet Tuesday morning, Earth Standard Time. They belonged to the Survey and Acquisition Division, a department that did exactly what its name suggested. They had been sent to conduct a resource audit. Their orders were simple: scan the system, take samples, record what was useful, and file a report. They had done this thousands of times before. It was routine. It was boring. Most of their officers were only half paying attention. Their senior commander was a being called Assessor Grelvan, a tall, gray-skinned creature from one of the Conclave's oldest member worlds. He had filed hundreds of these reports in his career. He had never once encountered a problem. Primitive worlds did not cause problems. That was the definition of being primitive. You lack the ability to respond to beings far above you. His ships moved through the outer solar system without sending any signal, without asking any permission, without pausing. To them, this was not rude. It was simply the natural order of things. They reached Mars within 2 days. The colony there was small, about 40,000 people living under pressurized domes and inside carved rock tunnels. To Grelvan's instruments, the colonists appeared fragile and poorly defended. He ordered a surface drone to be deployed. It would collect soil samples and atmospheric data. The drone launched. It entered Mars' atmosphere. A voice crackled across every open channel in the solar system. It was calm. It was female. It had no anger in it, which somehow made it more frightening than anger would have been. "This is Admiral Yara O.C., commander of Earth's Orbital Defense Network. You have entered sovereign human space without authorization. You have deployed an object into the atmosphere of a human colony world without permission. You have 30 seconds to reverse all actions and withdraw your fleet to beyond the outer boundary of this system. This is the only warning you will receive." Grelvan heard the transmission. He stared at it for a moment. Then he made a small sound, the equivalent of a laugh in his species. When he turned to his crew and said something that his species used to describe the harmless noise made by creatures too small to matter. He did not reverse course. He did not withdraw his fleet. He ordered the drone to continue its descent. 29 seconds passed. What happened next took 11 seconds. The 12 Conclave ships did not explode dramatically. They did not burn in cinematic fireballs. They simply came apart. Quickly, precisely, completely. The orbital defense grid that surrounded the inner solar system, disguised for decades as weather monitoring stations, debris nets, and dead satellites, had been tracking every ship since the moment they crossed Neptune's orbit. The targeting had been done before Osei even opened the channel. The warning had been genuine. The countdown had been real. In 11 seconds, there was nothing left of Grelvan's fleet except expanding clouds of debris and cooling metal. The drone, halfway through its descent into Mars' atmosphere, received no further instructions. It fell the rest of the way on its own and broke apart on the surface. No one on the Martian colony was hurt. Admiral Osei filed a brief incident report and returned to her coffee. The wreckage footage reached the Galactic Conclave's central chamber 6 days later. It was played in full before the entire assembly, all 427 member civilizations, represented by their ambassadors, out of their commanders and their senior officials. The chamber was one of the largest constructed spaces in the known galaxy. It could hold hundreds of thousands of beings at once, and it was rarely quiet. There were always arguments, always negotiations, always the noise of many species trying to exist together under one roof. When the footage ended, the chamber was completely silent, not the polite silence of a crowd waiting for a speaker, not the temporary silence between words. It was the deep, heavy silence of beings who had just seen something they did not have a proper category for. Several ambassadors replayed the 11-second clip. Then again, some of them brought in analysts and weapons specialists who had spent decades studying military technology. The analysts watched the footage. Then they went very quiet too. The problem was not just the speed of the strike, it was the patience behind it. Those defense platforms had been built and hidden over decades. The humans had known, for a long time, that something might come. And they had not panicked. They had not announced what they built. They had simply prepared quietly, completely, and waited. That was the part that nobody in the chamber knew how to process. One senior conclave official, an ancient being from a water world called Vareth, leaned toward his aide and spoke in a low voice. "How long have they had those weapons?" he asked. His aide checked the analysis reports. "We believe at least 60 years. Sir." The old being from Vareth was silent for a moment. "And in 60 years," he said slowly, "they never used them. Not once. Not on each other. Not on anyone. No, sir." He folded his hands. He looked at the frozen debris cloud on the screen, at the place where 12 ships used to be. "They were waiting," he said. "They were always waiting." Nobody in the chamber had a response to that. Outside, in the cold dark between stars, the Sol system looked exactly as it always had. Quiet, small, and unremarkable. A pale sun surrounded by a handful of ordinary planets. It looked that way on purpose. Inside the conclave, an emergency session was called. The vote to respond was nearly unanimous. They would not send diplomats. They would not send a message. They would not ask questions or seek explanations. They would send a fleet. Not 12 ships this time. They would send enough to make sure there was no solar system left to defend. The Galactic Conclave had not built a fleet like this in 2,000 years. The last time such a force had been assembled, it had ended a war between 3 civilizations and reshaped the borders of an entire star cluster. That fleet had been remembered ever since as the largest show of power in galactic history. Songs had been written about it. Statues had been raised. Entire generations of young soldiers across dozens of worlds had grown up hearing stories about its scale, its discipline, and the absolute certainty it had carried into battle. The new fleet was bigger. It took 3 months to assemble. Ships were pulled from defense stations, border patrols, and reserve fleets across 212 member civilizations. Shipyards that had been idle for decades were reactivated. Supply lines were rerouted. Commanders who had been retired were called back. When the final count was done and the fleet stood together at the assembly point beyond the edge of the Sol system, it numbered 9,700 warships. 9,700. The supreme marshal chosen to lead it was a being named Volth Karan, from a species called the Drellic. The Drellic were tall, broad, and covered in a natural gray-black armor that their bodies grew over decades. They had been warriors for so long that the concept of peace still felt slightly foreign to their culture. One Voth Karayan himself had fought in 11 military campaigns across his long life and had never lost one. He was not a cruel being. He was simply completely certain of himself, the way that only someone who had never truly been surprised could be. He stood at the front of his flagship's command deck and looked at the sensor display showing the Sol system ahead. It was small, a single modest star, 8 planets, and a handful of moons and asteroid clusters. He had conquered larger systems in his sleep. He broadcast his message to Earth on all available frequencies. Every human receiver in the solar system picked it up. On Earth, on Mars, in the asteroid belt stations, on the Jupiter moon outposts. Every screen, every radio, every communication device suddenly carried the same voice. Voth Karan's translator spoke in clean, flat human language. Species designation, human. You have committed an act of violence against the Galactic Conclave. Well, you have destroyed 12 vessels and ended the lives of their crews. Under Conclave law, this act carries a formal response. You are given 72 hours to comply with the following terms. All weapon systems in the Sol system are to be permanently dismantled. All political and military leadership is to surrender themselves to Conclave authority. The planet Earth and all human territories will be placed under supervised management. Failure to comply will result in total military action. Well, you have 72 hours. The message ended. On Earth, in a deep underground facility built beneath the Swiss Alps, the United Earth Defense Council met within the hour. Around the table sat generals, admirals, scientists, and the elected heads of Earth's 7 governing regions. The room was quiet. On the main screen, the sensor feed showed the Conclave fleet sitting at the edge of the system. 9,700 bright points of light, steady and patient. While some people around the table looked pale, a few were clearly shaking. One regional governor immediately argued for negotiation. Another called for a formal surrender, saying that fighting was suicide, that no single solar system could stand against the combined military of 200 civilizations, that the only sane choice was to give the Conclave what it wanted and try to survive within whatever terms they offered. Admiral Yara Osi sat at the far end of the table and said nothing during these arguments. She let people speak. She drank her coffee. She watched the screen. When the room finally ran out of words, she set down her cup. "We are not surrendering," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "And we are not negotiating. What we are going to do is get to work." She was not alone in that position. Beside her sat Commander Dren Vasquez, a compact, dark-eyed man who had spent the last 20 years fighting resource wars in the asteroid belt. Ugly, close quarters, fighting in the dark between rocks, where survival depended on improvisation and the willingness to take losses and keep moving. Next to him was Dr. Lena Cho, a small woman with gray-streaked hair and ink-stained fingers, who had spent 30 years running theoretical weapons experiments in a classified facility on the lunar surface. Why, she had built things that even most of the Defense Council did not know existed. The 3 of them had been planning for exactly this moment for a very long time. Not because they had known the Conclave was coming, but because they had known something would come, eventually. Earth had spent centuries being told by its own history that the universe was not safe and that preparation was not optional. When they had applied that lesson to the stars the same way they had always applied it to everything else, while the rest of the galaxy had been cataloging Earth as a primitive footnote, Earth had been doing what Earth always did. It had been getting ready. Over the next 72 hours, the Defense Council did not broadcast a reply to Vothkaran. There was no counteroffer, no negotiation request, no white flag signal. The Conclave fleet waited at the edge of the system. There were no sudden burst of construction activity, no sudden burst of construction activity. Everything looked quiet. It was not quiet. Deep inside the asteroid belt, Commander Vasquez was meeting with the crews of 40 heavy mining vessels, walking them through a plan that made several of them go very still when they heard it. He did not order them to agree. He told them what it was, what it would cost, and what it would accomplish. Then he waited. Every single one of them said yes. On the lunar surface, Dr. Cho and her team were finishing the final calibration on a device that had taken 11 years to build and that the Conclave's best scientists would have declared theoretically impossible for a Tier 0 species to construct. She ran the numbers one more time. They were correct. They had always been correct. She initialed the final authorization document and told her team to begin the deployment sequence. Admiral Osei spent the 72 hours in her command center running simulations, not to find out if the plan would work. She had already decided it would work. She ran them to find every place it might fail, every gap, every weakness, every point where the Conclave fleet might find a way through. Each time she found one, she closed it. When the 72 hours ended, the Conclave fleet crossed the outer boundary of the Sol system. They entered in formation, precise, confident, exactly as they had been trained. 9,700 ships moving together in a pattern that had won battles across the galaxy for 2 centuries. Their sensors swept ahead of them, looking for defenses, looking for weapons, looking for any sign of organized resistance. What their sensors showed them was a solar system that looked almost completely empty. Voth-Karan studied his display and felt a small flicker of something he had not felt in many years. He could not name it yet, but it was there. It felt like the moment before a door opens, when you do not yet know what is on the other side, but something in the back of your mind is very quietly telling you to stop. He did not stop. He ordered the fleet forward. The door opened. The first ships to die never saw what killed them. The Conclave fleet entered the Sol system in a wide formation. It's moving in from the direction of Neptune. It was the standard approach pattern used by Conclave military forces for over 1,000 years. Broad, powerful, designed to overwhelm any defense by sheer weight of numbers. The lead group was made up of 800 warships, heavy vessels, thick armor, long-range weapons. They were the tip of the spear, and they moved forward with the quiet confidence of soldiers who had never once considered the possibility that the ground beneath their feet was not ground at all. It was not ground. Neptune's orbit was surrounded by what looked, on basic sensors, like natural ice debris, chunks of frozen rock drifting slowly in wide, lazy paths. The kind of thing found at the edge of any outer solar system. The Conclave's forward scouts had swept the area and flagged it as clear. There was nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. What their sensors had not detected, because they had been built to look for technology, and what surrounded them was disguised as nature, were 10,000 gravitational pulse mines, each one buried inside a hollowed-out piece of rock and ice, each one perfectly still, each one waiting. Admiral Osei gave the activation order from her command center with a single quiet word. The mines did not explode like traditional weapons. They released focused gravitational pulses, short, violent bursts of force that hit a ship the way a hammer hits glass. They did not burn. They did not leave fire. They simply pulled every piece of a vessel in slightly different directions at the same time, and the ships came apart from the inside. 800 Conclave warships entered the Neptune corridor. 41 made it through. The sensor footage reached Voth-Karan on his flagship within seconds. He stared at it. His command crew stared at it. Nobody spoke for a full 10 seconds, which on a military command deck in the middle of an active battle was a very long time. Then Voth-Karan's senior tactical officer said, in a very careful voice, "Supreme Marshal, the debris field. It was manufactured, every piece of it. They built it to look natural. Our sensors were never looking for something disguised as nothing." Voth-Karan ordered the fleet to halt and reassess. He rerouted the main body away from the outer debris fields. He called in his best analysts. He ordered full-spectrum scans of everything ahead. While his analysts worked, something else was already moving. Deep inside the asteroid belt, Commander Dren Vasquez sat in the cockpit of a retrofitted mining vessel called the Broken Pick. Around him, spread across 300 kilometers of rock and shadow, were 39 other ships just like his. Old, heavy, scarred from years of belt work, and now packed from floor to ceiling with shaped explosive charges. Behind him, in the crew section, sat 100 men and women who had spent their lives mining rock in the dark between planets. They were not soldiers. They had not been trained for this, but they had heard Vasquez's plan. They had understood what it required, and they had come anyway. The Conclave's flanking wing, a group of 900 ships moving along the inner edge of the asteroid belt, was trying to circle around the main debris fields and reach Mars from the side. It was a sound tactical decision. In any normal battle, it would have worked. Vasquez watched them come on his screen. He waited until the flanking wing was deep inside the belt, surrounded on all sides by rock and limited in how quickly it could turn. Then he opened a channel to all 40 ships. "Those same as we discussed," he said. "Pick your target. Don't miss." The 40 mining vessels ignited their engines simultaneously and drove straight into the flanking wing at full speed. They did not fire weapons. They did not try to fight. They simply aimed themselves at the largest ships in the formation and did not turn away. The resulting series of collisions and detonations tore through the Conclave flanking wing like a storm through a paper wall. The asteroids around them, destabilized by the blasts, began to shift and collide, creating a chain of secondary impacts that continued for hours. When the belt finally settled, the 900-ship flanking wing had been reduced to less than 60 vessels, most of them badly damaged. Vasquez's ship was gone. All 40 of them were gone. Osei received the confirmation report. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them and moved on. There was still work to do. Vasquez had known that too. It was why he had gone first. Voth Karan was now dealing with losses that his models had classified as statistically impossible. He had lost over 1,000 ships and had not yet reached Mars. He ordered the main fleet, still more than 7,000 strong, to push forward directly toward the inner system. No more flanking. No more splitting the force. Pure mass. He would overwhelm whatever defenses remained through sheer numbers. That was when Dr. Lena Cho activated her device. The Stellar Excitation Array had been built in pieces over 11 years, its components disguised as solar observation equipment and research satellites scattered around the Sun's equatorial region. When fully connected and activated, it did not fire a weapon in any traditional sense. It reached into the Sun itself and gave it a very precise push. The result was a controlled solar flare, not a random eruption, but a shaped corridor of superheated plasma directed along a specific path through the inner system. Dr. Cho had spent years calculating exactly where to point it. She pointed it at the largest concentration of conclave ships. 1,200 vessels were caught in the flare corridor. There was no defense against the star. There was no armor thick enough, no shield strong enough, no evasive maneuver fast enough. The 1,200 ships simply ceased to exist, here replaced briefly by a brighter region of the solar wind before even that faded. On the conclave flagship, an alarm was screaming. Voth Karayan's tactical crew was shouting numbers at each other. His fleet was now below 5,000 ships and still had not fired a single effective shot at anything human. He pushed the remaining fleet toward Earth. It was the last mistake he had left to make. What waited around Earth was not a defense line. It was a machine built specifically to end this battle. Railgun platforms disguised as orbital stations opened fire from 16 different angles. Clouds of autonomous combat drones, hundreds of thousands of them, each one small, each one fast, each one carrying a single-shaped charge, swarmed out from hidden deployment bays on the lunar surface. Relativistic kill vehicles, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light and launched from mass drivers buried in the asteroid belt weeks earlier, were already arriving, only invisible until the moment of impact. The conclave fleet hit the kill box around Earth and began to die. Not slowly, not dramatically, steadily, methodically. The way a system works when every part of it has been designed by people who knew exactly what they were doing and had spent decades making sure it would not fail. The battle around Earth lasted 2 days. At the end of it, the kill box was filled with wreckage that would drift in orbit for 1,000 years. Of the 9,700 ships that had entered the Sol system, 18 had turned and run on the very first day, when the Neptune corridor had opened up and swallowed 800 ships in minutes. Those 18 had seen enough. They had turned their engines away from the inner system and had not looked back. They were the only ones still alive. The Battle of Sol was over. It had lasted 6 days in total. The 18 ships ran. They pushed their engines as hard as they could go, burning fuel at rates that would leave most of them stranded before they reached the outer system. They did not care about fuel. They did not care about formation. They did not communicate with each other. Every captain on every one of those 18 ships had looked at their sensor screens during that first hour of battle, had watched 800 warships disappear in a matter of minutes, and had made the same private calculation. The math was not complicated. The conclusion was not difficult. They ran because they understood, faster than the rest of the fleet, that they were not in a battle. They were inside a trap that had been years in the making, built by a species that had been quietly preparing for exactly this moment, and the only intelligent thing left to do was leave. They almost made it, and they had crossed beyond the orbit of Pluto and were pushing toward the edge of the heliosphere, the boundary where the sun's reach finally gave way to open interstellar space, when a single vessel appeared on their sensors ahead of them. It had not been there a moment before. It had been running dark. No emissions, no active systems, drifting in the black like a piece of debris. Now its systems came online all at once. And it sat directly across the only viable exit corridor from the Sol system, large and completely still. The ship was identified in the Conclave database as a human carrier vessel. Its name was painted in large letters along its hull in the human writing system that the Conclave's translation systems had long since cataloged. UEDS, Unconquered Sun. It was a big ship, not as large as some of the Conclave's heaviest warships, but built with a kind of dense, a heavy-boned practicality that made it look like it had been designed specifically to survive things that should have destroyed it. Its weapon arrays were visible and fully active. Its targeting systems were locked on all 18 vessels simultaneously. The 18 ships stopped. For several minutes, nothing happened. The unconquered sun sat in their path and did not move and did not speak. The 18 captains opened private channels to each other, exchanging short, clipped sentences. Some wanted to try to go around the carrier. Some wanted to fire first. One captain from a small species called the Veth simply powered down his weapons entirely and waited, which was either the wisest thing anyone did that day or the most desperate. Then a transmission came through. It was a single line in the flat translator language the Conclave used for interspecies communication. Power down your weapons and your engines. You will not be harmed. One of warning before destroying them all. One of warning before destroying them all. One by one, the 18 ships powered down. 2 hours later, a shuttle left the unconquered sun and crossed the gap between the carrier and the largest of the surviving Conclave vessels, the flagship of the Drellic Supreme Marshal, Voth Karan. The shuttle docked without ceremony, no escort of fighters. No accompanying security vessels. Just one small craft, moving slowly and without any attempt at intimidation. Admiral Yara Ose stepped off the shuttle alone. She had done this deliberately. She had argued with her security chief about it for 20 minutes before leaving, and she had won the argument the way she won most arguments, by simply telling the other person the decision was already made and walking away. She understood something about the psychology of what she was about to do. Arriving with armed soldiers would have communicated threat. Arriving alone communicated something else entirely. It said, I am not afraid of you. I never was. And I think it is time you understood that clearly. She was wearing her standard uniform. Dark gray, no decorations, no ceremony. She carried nothing except a small insulated container. The corridors of the Conclave flagship were wide and built for beings taller than her. Swanee and the few surviving crew members who saw her pressed themselves against the walls as she passed. None of them spoke. None of them moved to stop her. They watched her the way people watch something they cannot fully process, something that does not fit into any category they have been given. She found Voth Karayan on the command deck. He was sitting in his commander's chair, but not in the way a commander sits. He was sitting the way a very tired being sits when the weight of what has happened has settled fully onto their body, and they no longer have the energy to hold themselves straight. The main display in front of him was still active. It showed the Sol system. It showed the debris fields. It showed the numbers. The running total of ship losses that the system had been updating automatically throughout the battle, right up until there were no more ships left to update. 9,682. And the number sat in the corner of the screen in small, precise text. Osei looked at it. Then she looked at Voth Karan. She pulled a chair from a nearby station, a human-sized one that one of the crew had clearly placed there sometime before she arrived, and she sat down across from him. She opened the insulated container. Inside were 2 cups of coffee, still hot. She placed one on the console in front of Voth Karan. She kept the other for herself. Voth Karan looked at the cup. Oh, he looked at her. His large dark eyes were difficult to read. The Drellic did not show emotion the way humans did, but his hands, resting on the arms of his chair, were not steady. Osei drank her coffee and began to speak. She spoke for 20 minutes. The story does not record every word she said, because what she said was not meant for history. It was meant for him. She spoke about Earth, about what it had taken to survive on it. Hona, about the wars humans had fought with each other over centuries, the terrible, grinding, costly wars, and about what those wars had done to the species on the other side of them. She did not speak with anger. She did not lecture. She spoke the way a person speaks when they are telling someone something important, and they want to make sure it is understood. She told him that humans had not built their defenses out of aggression. They had built them out of memory. They had been hurt too many times by each other and by the cold indifference of a universe that did not care whether they lived or died. And they had decided, not once but over and over again across generations, that they were going to survive it, whatever it took, whatever the cost. She told him that the Conclave had not sent a fleet to conquer an undefended world, and they had sent a fleet to attack a species that had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment since before the first human being had ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. She told him she was sorry for his losses. She meant it. When she was finished, she stood up. She looked at his untouched coffee cup. She left it where it was. She walked back through the silent corridors of his ship, back to her shuttle, and back to the unconquered sun. Behind her, Arn in his command chair, Volth Karan sat for a long time without moving. Then slowly he reached out and picked up the cup. It was still warm. He drank it. He did not know what it tasted like. He did not have a reference for it, but he drank it to the end, set the cup down carefully, and then gave the order to release all 18 ships and plot a course for home. His hands were steadier now, not much, but a little. The 18 ships went home. They traveled slowly, most of them running on minimum power, their fuel reserves nearly empty. They moved through the dark between stars in loose, ragged clusters. Not a fleet anymore, just a collection of damaged vessels carrying the only survivors of the largest military disaster in the history of the Galactic Conclave. They did not speak much to each other on the journey. Every captain had their own version of the same silence to sit with. When they finally reached Conclave space, they were met by a formal reception escort, not out of honor, but because the Conclave High Council needed to control the arrival. There were already rumors spreading through every connected world in the galaxy. The numbers had leaked. 9,700 ships sent. 18 returned. Even before any official announcement, beings across hundreds of worlds had begun doing the math, and the math was producing reactions that ranged from disbelief to something much closer to fear. The Conclave High Council convened a full hearing within the week. It was not a quiet proceeding. The chamber was packed, every seat filled, observation galleries crowded, and the proceedings broadcast live to every member world. There had not been a session of this importance in living memory for most of the species present. The 18 captains were called to speak one by one. They came from 18 different species. They spoke in 18 different native languages, and all translated in real time for the chamber. But despite the differences in their voices and their faces, and the specific ways each of them described what they had seen, the testimonies were remarkably alike in one important way. None of them gave a military report. They had all been given the standard forms to fill out. The official Conclave framework for after-action testimony, with its neat categories for tactical analysis, enemy capability assessment, recommended counter-strategies, and projected engagement outcomes. Most of them had left large sections of those forms blank. One captain, a female from a species called the Soren, who had silver-gray skin and very large expressive eyes, had written a single sentence across the entire tactical analysis section of her form and left everything else empty. The sentence said, "There is no counter-strategy. I do not know what to write here." What they gave instead were accounts, personal ones. The Soren captain described standing at her viewport during the Neptune Corridor event and watching 800 ships disappear and trying to understand that she had watched 800 ships disappear. A captain from a heavy world species called the Durek, beings who were physically large, slow to emotion, and well known in the Conclave for their steadiness under pressure, broke down completely in the middle of his testimony and could not continue for several minutes. When he resumed, he said only that he had fought in 6 campaigns across his career and that nothing had prepared him for the experience of watching a solar flare be used as a directed weapon by a species that was not supposed to be capable of building such a thing. The chamber was quiet through all of it, the usual background noise of 400 civilizations trying to conduct business together. The rustling, the murmuring, in the constant low hum of translation equipment inside conversations, was almost entirely absent. People were listening in the way that people listen when they are genuinely unsure what to do with what they are hearing. When all 18 captains had spoken, the council opened the floor for debate. The debate was not short, it ran for 11 days. There were voices calling for a second armada, larger this time, more carefully planned, with full intelligence on human defense capabilities before any approach was made. These voices argued that the conclave's authority across the galaxy depended on its willingness to respond to military action with military action, and that accepting this outcome without response was a precedent that would weaken every agreement and alliance the conclave had built over centuries. There were other voices, quieter ones at first, and they pointed out that building a second armada would take years and enormous resources, and that in that time humanity would keep building too. They pointed out that the first armada had gone in with more ships than had ever been assembled in one place, and had achieved nothing except the permanent loss of 9,682 vessels and everyone aboard them. They asked very carefully what a second armada was expected to accomplish that the first one had failed to do. The debate might have continued longer. But on the fourth day, Admiral Osei's sensor packages arrived. She had sent them with the 18 ships, complete recordings of the entire six-day battle from the human side, every tactical display, every weapons deployment, every order given and received, every phase of the battle from the Neptune corridor to the Earth kill box, laid out in full technical detail with no information removed or obscured. It was not a boast. It was not a threat. It was simply a complete record, offered without comment, in the same spirit that a person might lay all their cards face up on a table to make clear that the game is already over. The council played the recordings in full in the chamber on the fifth day. The chamber watched 6 days of the battle in compressed form over 8 hours. They watched the mines activate. They watched the asteroid belt assault. They watched the solar flare. They watched the kill box around Earth work with the quiet, relentless efficiency of a machine that had been built to do exactly one thing and had done it completely. They watched the casualty numbers climb in the corner of the display, a small automatic counter that kept updating itself without drama or commentary. Just numbers, just the plain record of what had happened. When it ended, when one of the oldest members of the High Council, a being so ancient that its species had been among the founders of the conclave itself, raised one thin arm and asked to speak. It said only this: "We sent a force to end a civilization. The civilization is unchanged. We are not. I believe the correct response is obvious." The vote for formal recognition was held the next day. It passed unanimously. The document was transmitted to Earth 6 days later. It arrived in the early morning to Earth Standard Time and was received by the communications array on the lunar surface before being forwarded to the Defense Council and from there to Admiral Osei's personal terminal. She read it alone in her quarters on the unconquered sun, which was back in Earth orbit by then, its hull still carrying the faint scorch marks from the battle's edge. The document was formal and dense with conclave legal language, but its meaning was clear. The Sol system and all human territories were recognized as sovereign and inviolable. The recognition was unanimous. The recognition was permanent. At the very bottom of the document, below all the official seals and the signatures of 427 member civilizations, there was a small note. It had no signature. It had no official marking. It appeared to have been added by someone without authority to add it, someone low in the conclave's bureaucratic structure whose name would never be known. Someone who had watched the recordings, perhaps, or had listened to the 18 captains, or had simply looked at the numbers and felt the need to say something honest in a document that was otherwise made entirely of formal language. 4 words: do not provoke them. Osei read the note. She read it twice. She sat with it for a moment. Then she folded the document carefully, once lengthwise, once across, and opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside were 18 envelopes. Each one had been written by hand, in her own careful script, addressed to a family, to a parent, a partner, a child, a sibling. 18 letters for Commander Vasquez and the 3,999 others who had gotten into their ships in the asteroid belt and not come back. She had written them herself because she had not been able to ask anyone else to do it. She had not known what to say in most of them. She had said it anyway. She placed the folded document in the drawer beside the letters. She closed the drawer. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked back to the command deck. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. Outside, through the viewport, Earth turned slowly in the dark. Blue and white, and very much alive. The same as it had always been. The same as it intended to keep being. Small and quiet and absolutely impossible to finish.